Hello, my name is Tutherine Penry. I'm a solitary pagan witch, I'm an author and the founder of the Wolf and Howl Press. And here I am today on a June day, and it doesn't feel like June at all. It's wild, it's windy, we've had storms, yesterday we even had hailstones. Anyway, today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about knot magic. Now there are all sorts of different types and means we can use in order to create magic, to cast a spell. But knot magic, believe it or not, it's not practiced that much now, but it was at one time one of the most feared types of magic across the whole of Western Europe. And part of the reason for this was that it was associated a great deal with hexing and with causing impotence and the inability to conceive a child. Now that becomes quite a threat to society if it happens enough. If it happens to families who have a lot of property to leave, for example, it's going to cause them great headaches because they won't have an heir. And this sort of thing was considered terribly important centuries ago, when you had a very small elite running, whole city-states or, countries. So the whole business of knot magic becomes quite an issue. And you do find some hysterically funny stories from it. You get things like, people getting married in secret so that nobody can hex them on their wedding day, because this is how the hex was cast. It was done on the wedding day. And it was done by tying knots or, anything really. That people became so obsessed with it that they wouldn't have any knots in their shoelaces, or they wouldn't have a knot on their clothing. And I always have this vision of people slopping miserably out of church because they can't do their shoelaces up. And I think if we go a little bit further back, though, we see that knots were used in all sorts of things. We don't think of it nowadays. This is part of the problem. We don't realise how essential a good knot was. But when you think of it, the great cathedrals, say, of Europe, which were built, they were the tallest buildings, they were the skyscrapers, if you like, the equivalent of a skyscraper of their time. They were massively high. They were built with wooden scaffolding that was held together with rope and knots. People's lives depended on it. If you're at sea, you depend upon good, appropriate knot tying for the task in hand. Back in the days when there were sailing ships, which is only really 140 years ago, they were still sailing ships. You had to have proper knots for the rigging, proper knots to hold things, hold the all sorts of stuff. And this idea of having the appropriate knot is obviously something, it shows us then how important good knot tying was. I used to have an uncle, in fact, my book on knot magic was dedicated to this uncle of mine. And we always used to joke, he'd been to sea, he'd sailed the seven seas, he had wonderful stories to tell. And he'd actually caught the very last of the big sailing clippers and ships. And he could tie any sort of knot you wanted, and everything would be sort of spliced properly or knotted properly. And he used to teach all the neighbourhood children to tie knots and do tricks with string and stuff. But we don't really realise how magical knots are in their own right. You sometimes hear people say, I couldn't tie a knot to save my life. Well, maybe not. But I think you'd have a good try if your life were at stake. But what people don't realise, and it's one of the things that makes knots terribly magical, is that knots tie themselves. Now, that might sound a very bizarre statement to make, but I challenge you on this one. You go away and look, say, in your jewellery box. How many times have you gone to your jewellery box having put away a nice little chain necklace, little narrow chain? You put it away, and you put it away neatly, and you come back, and there's a great big knot in it. And you find this with a lot of things. The knots tie themselves. Cables will knot themselves. You haven't tied a knot, but the minute you turn your back, something happens. Well, this is actually quite true. Knots do tie themselves. This is not some crazed argument from an old witch. This is actually quite true, and there has been research on it, which has proved that if you put pieces of string of varying thickness into a box and then you tumble the box around a bit, when you open the box again, a lot of the strings and threads and cords are knotted without any human agency. They do indeed knot themselves, and those who know about such things have pointed out that the knots are mathematically quite complex. It's not just a simple overhand knot or a granny knot. They are quite complex, these knots. So there is something inherently magical in a knot even before we start. And I always think this is something to bear in mind. Knots have been put to so many uses. They were used on clothes. Before the days of Velcro, they were used shoelaces. Everybody had to tie their shoelaces. One of the first things I had to learn when I was a child, do your shoelaces up. People would hook over they'd have special hooks and things for tying laces on their boots and stuff like that. The whole of society, if you like, was geared to tying knots. You sent a parcel, you tied it up with brown paper. And of course, we relied upon it much more than we do now. But one of the great things I think about knots is that we don't have to be great knot tiers. If we did, then every Boy Scout and Girl Guide would be a magical threat to us. And of course they're not. What we have instead is an understanding of knots. You can cast quite complex spells with really the very simplest knot, an overhand knot, just literally across and through, and that's it. Because it depends what you're trying to do, you see. Knots can work in several ways. They are essentially deceptive. They can cause a single piece of string or cord to look like two pieces joined together. They can make two pieces act and behave like one if you join them together. You can also use the simple overhand knot to act as a stopper, to stop yourself losing something. So you tie it at the end of a string. That's where it goes. You see, everything we do in magic has to work here, first of all. It's no good just sitting there with a lovely book of spells and saying, oh, well, this is what I do. It doesn't really work like that. If you want to make magic enter your life, you have really got to understand how it works. And it works up here. Because unless you get your thoughts in order, you can't focus your will. Now, focus is a very interesting word. It comes from the Latin word for a half, you see, the focal point. The focal point of the whole or the home or what have you, it was the half. And we've got to focus, like focusing on a flame. And we have to make it something now we really think about it. What do we really want? You know? You lose track of the number of times you talk to people and they're trying to tell you something, but they've got it all back to front. And it takes them twice as long. And everybody's getting very frustrated because they have not marshalled their thoughts together. And that's just in telling a simple story. Now you imagine what happens if you're trying to cast a spell and you do something like that. You're going to get results you don't expect. And no amount of fancy knot tying is going to put that right. So as I say, you have to get your thoughts right first. What do you want? Do you want the spell to join something together? To pull it apart? Do you want it to fix something? Do you want it to fix a series of things? Do you want it to prevent something from leaving? In which case, perhaps put a knot in the string and thread a bead onto it to symbolize what you're doing. That's all it does. It symbolizes what you're doing. It acts as the focus. And, you can get by with a handful of themes in your magic. You know, joining, separating, stopping things happen, making them happen. Those are 4 things, and they're pretty straightforward. But if you actually go away and think about most of the spells you want to cast, it's going to cover most of them. Very, very simple. And simplicity is the key, you see. If you go for the complicated to start with, that's fair enough. It does attract people, But the real skill is not in getting more and more complicated in magic. It's in stripping it back and making it more and more simple. And knots are brilliant for that. So I'll leave you with that thought now, and thank you very much for listening. Goodbye.